Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Burnham, and I am the Assistant Director of the American Swedish Historical Museum and co-chair of our lecture series committee. This is the first lecture in our series. The New Sweden Legacy Lecture Series evolved from a one-day New Sweden History Conference in an effort to reach people on a wider scale in a more convenient virtual format. The program committee is made up of members from various historical organizations and universities who have come together to promote the New Sweden colony and its lasting impact on history. This series consists of 3 virtual lectures, one per month in January, February, and March, and will conclude with a final in-person lecture and brunch in April here at the American Swedish Historical Museum in South Philadelphia. A big thanks to all of our sponsors. Thank you to them. Each program is free to the public, and the lectures will be made available on the American Swedish Historical Museum's YouTube channel as a resource for future scholarship. I have a few Zoom reminders for today's program, and then I'll turn it over from a word from today's sponsor. We ask that you please keep yourself on mute for the duration of the lecture to minimize background noise. If you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the chat feature. And after the lecture, we will open the Q&A session. During that time, you can also use the raise hand feature, and the moderator will let you know when you can unmute and ask directly. Finally, as mentioned, this program is being recorded and a link will be emailed next week to access our public YouTube channel to view the lecture, where it will be available for everyone. Thank you all again for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to today's sponsor, the American Swedish Historical Museum, for a message about the organization. Tracy Beck, the director, will now introduce the museum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. We noticed that we had quite the group signed up for this, and we don't want to assume that you all know the museum. And so I just put together a few pictures. We are happy to sponsor this lecture in memory of our former executive director, Richard Waldron, who was both a scholar of the New Sweden colony and one of the people who started this conference in 2001. Our museum is located in Philadelphia and is the oldest Swedish museum in the United States, founded in 1926 to celebrate the contributions of Swedes to our country. The location for the museum was chosen because it was part of the land that the New Sweden colony was located on along the Delaware River. And so the New Sweden colony story has always been a big part of the museum's mission. Today, though, we interpret not just Swedish contributions to the US, but also those of Norwegians, Finns, Danes, Icelanders, and Sami people as well. We have a wide variety of exhibitions which explore art, history, and cultural topics. Our current exhibition is about sauna culture in Finland and really across the world, but with a primary focus on Finland. Upcoming exhibits are related to the Navy 250 anniversary in 2025 about shipbuilding in Philadelphia, as well as a small exhibit about Norwegian immigration to America. We also have a regular series of programs and events like most museums do. For those of you who don't live near Philadelphia, I hope that you will check out our virtual offerings, which include Swedish language classes, virtual field trips. Our next one at the end of the month is actually to the Bubs Candy Factory in Sweden, and also lectures like the one that you've joined us for today. I'm now going to turn it over to the museum's curator, Brett Peters, to introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks, Tracy. Hey, everyone. My name is Brett Peters. I'm the curator of the American Swedish Historical Museum and the co-chair of the New Sweden Legacy Lecture Series. So I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Paul Kahan. He is a leading expert on U.S. political, economic, and diplomatic history with a particular interest in the half century between Andrew Jackson's election to the presidency in 1828 and the so-called end of Reconstruction in 1877. He earned his PhD in U.S. history from Temple University and a Master's of Arts in Modern American History and Literature from Drew University. He has Bachelor of Arts degrees in History and English from Alfred University, and he's published 7 books, most recently, Philadelphia, A Narrative History. You can learn about Dr. Kahan and his work from his website, www.paulkahan, Kahan.com. With that being said, Paul, take it away.
Thank you very much, Brett, for that warm welcome. Tracy and Lauren, thank you for setting this up. I am delighted to be speaking to you today about my most recent book and the portion of it that relates to the Swedish Heritage Museum. Without further ado, we are going to get started. So as Brett mentioned, I recently published a book called Philadelphia, A Narrative History, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. And it is my 7th book. And all of my works deal in some way, shape, or form with the history of Pennsylvania. I knew that for this 7th book, I wanted to do a narrative history of the city of Philadelphia because there had been no single volume history of Philadelphia published since the early 1980s. So my entire lifetime, there hadn't been a history of the city of Philadelphia published. And I thought it was time to go back and rethink some of the things that we thought we knew about the city's history. In addition, unlike many scholars, I've spent most of my career working in museums. And so it's given me a deep appreciation of the role that objects and artifacts and places play in constructing what we think we know, what we think we remember about the past. And so my book starts from a kind of counterintuitive perspective, which is that Philadelphia does a terrible job remembering most of its own history. And I know that's going to come as a shock to many of you because, of course, you cannot swing a dead cat in Philadelphia without hitting something historically important. And believe me, I know I tried. The Philly PD has actually asked me to stop doing that, but I will persevere. In any event, yes, we do an incredibly good job remembering the American Revolution, right? I mean, we have a brand new museum of the American Revolution where they spent nearly $200 million building the building, assembling the artifacts, and every dollar of it shows. I like to describe that museum as the chocolate cake of museums because it's so dense and rich that you can't consume it all in a single visit. I've been to that museum many, many times, and I still think that there are things that I haven't seen or experienced. But when you consider that when that museum opened in 2017, the Museum of the City of Philadelphia, which is the picture on the right-hand side of the screen, was struggling and only had about another 8 months of existence left in it, you can begin to understand what I'm talking about. The city of Philadelphia and its generous bench of donors will spend hundreds of millions of dollars to support a museum dedicated to the history of the American Revolution, but it won't spend a few $100,000 to prop up an institution dedicated to telling the history of the city writ large. And I think that there are certainly many casualties of that myopic focus on the history of the American Revolution. Of course, one of them is the deep Swedish influence here in the city. And my guess would be that if you ask the average Philadelphian about the history, about Philadelphia's revolutionary history, you could get a pretty passable answer from them. But I think if you ask them about the Swedish history of the Delaware Valley, most of them would have no idea that New Sweden existed or that the Swedes played such an important role in the early history of what later became Philadelphia. And this is, of course, despite the fact that the city of Philadelphia's flag is a testament to the role, to that Swedish history. I mean, the colors were self-consciously selected as a memory to New Sweden and the Swedish influence in the Delaware Valley. And so thousands upon thousands of people walk by municipal buildings every day that are flying this flag and yet have absolutely no idea about European colonization in the Delaware Valley prior to William Penn. And so, in some ways, my book is an attempt to help correct that narrative. The book itself is built around 5 themes: diversity, conflict, anti-urbanism, space, and memory. And not all of these themes are directly relevant to my talk today, but certainly diversity, conflict, space, and memory will be. And I'm hoping that you'll keep an eye on those themes, because we're going to come back to them throughout the discussion. And I would hope that they would sort of animate the discussion that follows. And I'm looking forward to answering your questions and hearing your perspectives. Now, prior to the European colonization of what is now the Delaware Valley, Philadelphia was inhabited by a group of Native Americans known as the Lenni Lenape, or original man. These first inhabitants of North America arrived during the last ice age, between 30,000 and 10,000 years ago. And archaeologists and anthropologists think they crossed a land bridge spanning the Bering Strait and connecting modern day Alaska to Siberia. Over succeeding millennia, they migrated eastward, and by about 18,000 years ago, we had settlement here in the Delaware Valley. Now, the Lenape were semi-nomadic foragers and fishers who lived along what we now call the Delaware River in a roughly triangular shaped territory that you see outlined on that map. And that map is a little deceptive. It implies that those areas were continuously inhabited. The reality is that at most there were maybe a couple of thousand Lenni Lenape, most of whom were living in small bands of 2 or 3 dozen people, similar to the image that you see on the right. And they were semi-nomadic, which means that they would spend some months along the river, then they would move inland. They would return to a site a few times, but then they would move on to other sites that were not exhausted. They primarily foraged, fished, and hunted, although there was some agriculture at various periods of their existence. In short, the area of the Lenni Lenape, while large, was very sparsely populated. And so, as a result, when you have the arrival of Europeans, you didn't have quite as much conflict as you do in Virginia and in New England between the Native Americans and the European settlers. The earliest white settlers in the region were Dutch. In 1609, Henry Hudson sailed into the Delaware Bay aboard his ship, the Halve Moon. And that is an image of the Halve Moon right there, and Hudson is beneath it. He was sailing on behalf of, subsequent to his arrival, the Dutch West India Company arrived in the area and began trading with the Susquehannocks, who were a native people in what we would think of today as Lancaster County. These settlers who arrived in the 1620s were primarily interested in beaver pelts. And the reason is that beaver pelts, when properly cured, make waterproof hats. And so in the cold European climate, beaver pelts were incredibly valuable because they could be turned into very warm, waterproof hats. Now, in exchange for these beaver pelts, the Europeans would trade wampum. And wampum were cylindrical white or blue-black beads that were cut, polished, and strung together. And you can see an image of them right there. The strings of woven beads were worn decoratively, but they also functioned as a form of pictographic history text. They were exchanged between Europeans and the Native Americans. In fact, the most famous wampum belt is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and it memorializes William Penn's treaty with the Lenni Lenape later in the 17th century. Now, unfortunately for the European settlers, wampum is not naturally occurring in the Delaware Valley. It primarily occurs in what is now Long Island. So as a result, the Dutch were in constant contact with Dutch settlers in what they then called New Netherland in order to get supplies of wampum to trade with the Native Americans for beaver pelts. Traders exchanged European goods for beads and then in turn traded the beads for pelts in a small scale triangular trade. Initially, the Dutch behaved as traders, not colonizers, and so they left a light footprint in North America, which helped prevent conflict between the Europeans and the Native Americans. And that light footprint, again, very different from what goes on in New England, where entire families are coming and settling and are making it clear that they plan on being there permanently. Most of the Dutch that came were men. They were clearly not going to spend much time here. The area was sparsely populated, and so the amount of conflict was relatively little. Now, there were some hiccups. In 1631, the Dutch established a plantation station called Swannendel near present-day Lewis, Delaware, at the mouth of the Delaware Bay, and that did lead to some violence between the Lenape and the Native Americans. The Dutch were, of course, not the only Europeans eyeing the Delaware Valley. The English also wanted a piece of the very lucrative pelt trade. And so in 1610, English adventurer Captain Samuel Argall, an employee of the Virginia Company of London, explored what he later described as a very great bay, the Delaware. Unaware of Hudson's visit the year before, Argall named the bay that he had, quote unquote, discovered after his master, Thomas West, the 12th Baron de la Warre. And that, of course, came down to us as the Delaware Valley. And that's where that name stuck. And of course, because the English end up in control of the area, that becomes the name that sticks. The Lenni Lenape become known as Delaware Indians because of their close proximity to the Delaware River. Ironically, the last European power to seriously consider colonizing the Delaware Valley during this period proved to be the most successful, at least initially. And that, of course, were the Swedes. Under King Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden achieved military supremacy in the early stages of the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, and thus had pretensions to world power status. One element of those pretensions was the establishment of North American colonies. In March 1638, Peter Minuit, the man who in 1626 purchased Manhattan Island on behalf of the Dutch West India Company and served as its governor for 6 years, established the New World's first Swedish colony, New Sweden, on the Delaware Peninsula for his employer, the Swedish South Company. And I think it's important to kind of stop and take stock of what we're looking at. Peter Minuit had served both the Dutch and the Swedes and was intimately involved first in the settlement of what is today New York and then later the Delaware Valley. And I think that this points us to a really important consideration when looking at New Sweden, New Netherlands, these early settlements, which is that national ties were comparatively weak. Yes, there were Swedes, there were Dutch, there were Finns, but as we're going to see, their connection to their homelands was very loose. They were much more concerned about what was going on the day-to-day in the areas where they were. And so we have the same group of people or their descendants switching allegiance from Sweden to the Dutch to the English, almost without complaint. I mean, when you have these changes of regime, you don't have these mass purges because most of the people are willing to just go along to get along. And so when we talk about New Sweden or New Netherlands, it's important to recognize that we're actually projecting an identity onto these people that many of them didn't necessarily adopt themselves. Minuit was himself the sort of multicultural character who crops up frequently in the story of early settlements in the Delaware Valley. Born in what is now Germany, Minuit migrated in 1625 to the Netherlands, where he worked for the Dutch West India Company until he was dismissed over an internal power struggle. He was then hired by the New Sweden Company and commanded a largely Dutch crew. Landing at Swedes Landing, which is now Wilmington, Delaware, Minuit and his crew purchased land from the local natives and established Fort Christiana, a trading port at the mouth of the Christiana River, a place known to the Swedes as Minquaskill. Manned by only about 30 people, all men, it was hardly an auspicious beginning to the Delaware Valley's first permanent European settlement. And that, too, is something that's going to characterize European settlement in the Delaware Valley. It's a very, very light footprint until William Penn gets his charter from King James II. And that's when the floodgates of European settlement open. Now, of course, the big name in New Sweden is Johann Bjorn Prince. who comes to straighten things out. Because, of course, New Sweden failed to thrive as its investors had expected, in part due to the lack of wampum, which put it at a relative disadvantage when it came to trading with the Lenape, and also due to the fact that they had trouble getting people to go. It wasn't just Swedes that were in New Sweden at this time. By the time we get to the 1640s and 1650s, you're looking at a very polyglot group of Swedes, Finns, Dutch, even a few English. There are English in New Jersey. So it's a very much a polyglot place, but it's also a very lightly populated place. It was at the end of the world as far as these people were concerned, and you would have to be pretty desperate to want to go there. In 1643, Johann Bjornsson Prince arrived, and that's the gentleman on the left. The Lenape referred to him as Big Belly. And this was a man who knew how to create an image. He had for himself a suit made entirely of wampum. And wampum was hard to get and very valuable. So the fact that he could show up in a suit that covered his massive body in this gives you a sense of the type of power and wealth that he hoped to project. By the 1640s, the Delaware was filling up. You had Dutch, English, and Swedes. Yet, despite their keen interest in controlling it, none of those parties could risk conflict with one another. And partially that was due to the fact that there just weren't a whole lot of them. And part of that was due to the fact that their connections with their mother countries were incredibly tenuous. As a result, they could not count on backup. They would have to win any sort of struggle themselves. And there just weren't enough of them to do that. You throw into the mix the Native Americans, who are there and could potentially side with one group against another. And these groups had to live in at least tacit harmony with one another. And this is, I think, really important, that diversity breeds a certain amount of grudging tolerance. Now, believe me, if Prince could have killed the other folks in the area and seized the Delaware Valley for himself, he would have. He says that at one point. He just doesn't have the power. And so as a result, you create this muscle memory of tolerance that when William Penn arrives and creates his holy experiment is in existence already, which is not to say that he doesn't encourage it, but there had been a half a century of people living in at least tacit toleration with one another that he could then build upon. Prince eventually leaves in 1653, and in 1655, the Dutch government, headquartered in present-day Manhattan, New Netherlands, captures the Dutch forts in the Delaware Valley and takes control. And this was kind of a gambit for them. I mean, they basically took a chance that they would be able to succeed in the area, and they were. Yet the overwhelming majority of New Sweden's inhabitants elected to remain in the Delaware Valley, a mix of Swedes, Finns, English, and Dutch, who were forced to swear allegiance to New Netherlands. Again, probably grudging allegiance, but nevertheless, the Dutch were not in a position to ethnically cleanse the Delaware Valley, and that would have been undesirable. Because, of course, these were the folks that were dealing with the Native Americans on a daily basis, had relationships with them, knew how to get beaver pelts and other resources from the Native Americans. And so as a result, even though the Dutch control the area, it looks pretty much the same after the fall of New Sweden as it did before the fall of New Sweden, reinforcing again the fact that national ties were pretty loose. The Dutch were not to remain in control of the area long. It did nothing to obviate English interest in the region. Following the ascension of Charles II to the English throne in 1660, England adopted several mercantilist policies aimed at undermining Dutch dominance of world trade and thereby weakening Dutch control of the Delaware Valley. The English king's brother, James, Duke of York, who became King of England following his brother, had a great enthusiasm for capturing the area. Charles gave James all the land between the Delaware's eastern shore and the west bank of the Connecticut River. This becomes important later. A huge swath of territory that the English crown did not actually control. But of course, if the English king is giving it to his brother, it implies that the English crown is going to do something to control that territory. And in fact, in 1664, a squadron of English frigates commanded by Richard Nichols, a friend and political ally of James, and that's his coat of arms right there on the right, appeared in New Amsterdam, which is what the Dutch were calling New York, and successfully demanded surrender, which of all of their territory, including the Delaware Valley. Because the English, like the Dutch and the Swedes before them, lacked the military power to effectively subdue the region, as always, circumstances dictated peaceful coexistence. The area was sparsely populated. There were fewer than 200 European households in the Delaware Valley in 1664. And while there were a few Englishmen, most European residents were, again, Swedes, Finns, Dutch, and then, of course, you have Native Americans, and probably a few enslaved Africans. So again, we've seen the area transition through three different world empires in the space of a generation. But facts on the ground do not change. Your neighbor remains your neighbor. And the area remains incredibly sparsely populated. That is until the coming of William Penn. Now, as I had mentioned, James got control of this massive swath of territory when he became king. He, of course, continued owning it, and now the English controlled it. The problem is that James's government owed the Penn family a considerable amount of money, and he simply did not have the cash to pay it. So William Penn, who you can see various images of on the left, approached the king and with an idea, and he said, rather than give me the cash, why not give me the land, which I intend to create a permanent colony where my co-religionists, the Quakers, and other people can live in religious harmony, can have religious freedom. And this, of course, struck James as an incredibly good idea. For one thing, it would help quell some of the religious conflict that was characteristic of Charles and James's reign. For another thing, he was giving something that he really didn't have the wherewithal to turn into anything valuable, rather than giving money, which was always valuable. And, it worked out well for him. So in 1681, he grants William Penn a charter. Penn's plan was to create a colony where he would create a green country town. This is what he calls what eventually becomes Philadelphia, which was always intended to be on the river. And you can see the plan of Philadelphia there in the red circle, because the goal was to take all of the immense agricultural produce of this territory, funnel it through Philadelphia, down the Delaware River, and out into the world. As much as as much as Pennsylvania was intended to be a place of religious freedom and tolerance, it was also intended to be a money-making enterprise. Penn hoped to sell large portions of the land of the colony. He intended to rent others. And it was his hope that by taking this plan on, he would actually recoup more money than the crown owed him. This was always a money-making venture. And in that perspective, religious toleration was not just a moral good, it was also an economic good, because what it did was it encouraged people to move to the colony, not just Quakers, but Anglicans and Puritans and Catholics, Baptists, all kinds of folks from all across Europe. And as a matter of fact, Penn engaged in a very, very aggressive marketing campaign that was designed to get people to move to the New World. He marketed it in Ireland, in Scotland, in Germany, places where he knew there was a great deal of dissatisfaction. He said, look, we've got great land, it's very fertile, you can make a living here. And ultimately, the hope was that he would recoup his family fortune. Now, it doesn't really work out that way. Pennsylvania ends up swallowing his family fortune, but it's his story that we remember, right? We remember William Penn. The colony is named after his father, Pennsylvania. We have a massive statue of William Penn on top City Hall. We name things the Penn this, the Penn that. The outline of the city, at least in Center City, remains true to his vision for the city. So we see his fingerprints all over the place, but we don't see much of that Swedish heritage, despite the fact that there are tangible elements of that Swedish heritage, whether it's Gloria Dei, also known as Old Swedes Church, whether it's institutions like the museum. all of these different institutions in many ways are swimming against a current because there's been a collective forgetting about these events in favor of the revolution. And folks ask me, why is that the case? What they're surprised to find out is that during the 18th and the 19th century, Philadelphia was on the cutting edge of medicine, technology, science, all of those things. That it was a very forward looking city. So much so in the 19th century, it was known as the Athens of America. And yet today, in many ways, Philadelphia is a backward looking city. We tend to emphasize our history. And what I mean to say is our revolutionary history to the exclusion of many other things. And if I had to point to a specific event, I would point to the 1876 centennial, which was this moment celebrating the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And in many ways, it was designed to bind up the lingering wounds of the American Civil War, which had ended 12 years before. It took place in Fairmount Park. You can still see some remnants of it, most notably that little building in the center is Memorial Hall. That's where the Please Touch Museum is today. And it was an extravaganza. It showed off technology and industry and cultures from around the country and around the world. And it was really the Epcot center of its day, the land of tomorrow. But by encouraging thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people to come to Philadelphia, it also jump-started Philadelphia's tourist industry. And so sites like Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell and Ben Franklin's grave become bona fide tourist attractions. And once that happens and people realize how much money there is to be made, they begin emphasizing those things in many ways to the exclusion of other things. It's during this period that you get the famous myth about Betsy Ross sewing the first flag of the United States for George Washington, because her descendants owned a house that had a tangential connection to her and saw opportunities for making money. And today, if you go to your local county historical society and you go and you pick up like the big, heavily bound, musty history of the county or the town where you live, odds are it was published between 1876 and 1901, because this event kicks off a nostalgia for the past. It kicks off genealogy and interest in local history. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which is one of the most venerable historical institutions in the United States, starts in 1884 largely as a result of the efforts that the 1876 centennial spawn. But they don't capture all elements of Pennsylvania's history equally. There is a focus on the English history and on the period of the American Revolution. And there's a real kind of poo-pooing of the things that came earlier and the things that come later. And so as a result, what we end up with is a hyper focus on the period of the American Revolution, because that's what tourists want to see, and an ignorance of other periods that are equally important. And so as a result, things like the history of New Sweden have somewhat gone down Philadelphia's memory hole. And with that, I'm happy to answer a few questions.
Is there a concerted effort with the 250 celebration to readdress that neglect in popular history?
No. The 250th is going to focus almost entirely on the history of the American Revolution. There will be some downstream benefits for individual institutions for when people come to the city of Philadelphia, but their exhibits are going to try to tie into that. For instance, I work at the American Helicopter Museum and Education Center. We are going to mount an exhibit on Marine aircraft during that period, because the Marines were founded in Philadelphia in 1775. So we're actually moving our interpretation and our exhibit making closer to the American Revolution, trying to connect ourselves to it rather than trying to expand the focus. And from what I hear from other institutions, they're going to be doing the same thing. Now, that being said, so the 1876 centennial was the first World's Fair held in North America. It was the most successful of the celebrations of the Declaration of Independence. The next one, the 1926, was something of a bust. For those of you old enough to remember, you will remember that the 1976 was something of a bust. And in large part, the differences were there was concerted federal effort to support the 1876 centennial that did not exist in 1926 and 1976. You may remember that famous New York Post headline from 1975 when New York City was trying to stave off bankruptcy. Ford to City drop dead. Well, Ford to City drop dead meant the following year there was going to be very little federal funding available for a truly massive celebration. And so it was left to local groups to celebrate that event. And as you may remember, it was something, it left something to be desired. I don't know what 250 is going to portend. I do note that the federal government is not heavily involved in the financing. And I think with the incoming administration, what little interest there was is going to dwindle even further. Other questions?
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions but are, afraid to just ask, we do have the chat feature if you'd like to post questions in there as well.
As my daughters say, there is no such thing as a dumb question.
Thank you, Paul. I have a question. Thank you for your presentation. I'm intrigued by the notion that before this World's Fair, Philadelphia was a technology forward thinking. What are some examples
Sure.
of that technology?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was referred to as the Athens of America. When Andrew Jackson needed to get a pair of glasses as president of the United States, he didn't go to an optometrist in his home of Nashville or even in Washington, D.C. He ordered them from Philadelphia because that is where the leading physicians of the day were, in part because we had the leading medical institutions, some of which still exist, the College of Physicians, what is now Jefferson, all of these institutions. We had scientific organizations like the Franklin Institute. Today, the Franklin Institute is a museum dedicated to science, but in the 19th century, it was a laboratory for amateur and gentlemen scientists. And you would go and today, if you walk around the building, you can still see elements of this. In fact, I think if you go to the third floor, they have some of those big wooden doors that if you open up, they say patents. Like they just had a list of patents that you could consult while you were doing your experiments. And fun fact, they were initially in the Atwater Kent building, where the City Museum of Philadelphia was. So you had all of these kinds of institutions. The city waterworks were a scientific marvel that people came from around the world to see. Eastern State Penitentiary was at the cutting edge of penal reform in the 19th century. When Charles Dickens toured North America for the first time in the 1840s, he said there were two things he wanted to see. He wanted to see Niagara Falls, and he wanted to see Eastern State Penitentiary. Now, he didn't have great things to say about it, but it was a bona fide tourist attraction, right? 10,000 people visited the prison during its first few decades of operation. It's the kind of thing that we can't even imagine today. And so, it's all kinds of things like that. It's railroad technology. It's scientific innovation. The first balloon ascension, the hot air balloon ascension in North America took place in Philadelphia in 1784. I mean, this was the place to be for science and technology and medicine and all of that stuff. And was widely regarded as such. Beyond that, it was also a cultural hub. Today we tend to think of New York and Los Angeles as kind of setting the cultural messages. In the 19th century, that was Philadelphia. Most of you probably know that Edgar Allan Poe lived in Philadelphia and wrote some of his best-known short stories while he was here. Most of you probably don't know why he lived here, but it was because he was an editor of a magazine. And the magazines that people read in the 19th century were largely published here in Philadelphia. So it was a natural place to come if you were going to have that kind of career. Samuel Clemens, who later wrote under the pen name Mark Twain, briefly lived in Philadelphia, where he worked for the predecessor of the Philadelphia Inquirer. So, it was the cultural hub of Philadelphia in a way that or excuse me, of the United States in a way that we just don't appreciate. Things like Hamilton. Lin-Manuel Miranda wants you to believe that in New York you can be a new man. New York was a backwater until the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, and even after that, yes, it became an industrial behemoth. But that cultural influence is an artifact of the late 19th century. A lot of that play takes place in Philadelphia, even though he doesn't say that. When Aaron Burr is giving Hamilton a hard time about selling New York City down the river, and Hamilton says, well, we have the banks. They didn't have the banks. The bank was in Philadelphia. All that stuff is kind of elided. And so it's reading New York's history back into the 18th century. But, none of that existed at that time. Does that answer your question, Rob?
All right, very good. So next we'll go to Rebecca Bromley.
Okay.
Then after that, Philip Melnick had a question in the chat. Rebecca?
Okay, I was wondering how you understand the interest in New Sweden that led to the Swedish Colonial Society being formed in the early 1900s. I know right now I'm hearing from people from other lineage groups that there seems to be an uptick in the interest in genealogy. And with the ability to find a lot of stuff online, people can go back prior to the revolution instead of just focusing on DAR.
Right. Yeah, I think that I think a lot of that has to do with, and you're not going to like this answer, concerns about immigration at the late 19th century and about establishing who was and was not legitimately American. There is this shift in immigration patterns after the Civil War, but particularly after the 1870s. You get a lot more Russians, many of whom were Jews, particularly in Philadelphia. You get many more Italians. So the complexion of that immigration is changing, and I think that begins spurring these genealogical organizations, which are also an outgrowth of nostalgia for the revolutionary past as part of the centennial exhibit. But I think that also plays a role. And Teddy Roosevelt says some really nasty, bigoted things about what he calls hyphenated Americans, non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. There are a lot of those kinds of fights. There's a fair amount of religious strife between Protestants and Catholics at the end of the 19th century. During the 1884 presidential election, the issue of Romanism and rebellion becomes an issue. So I think that there's a lot of ethnic anxiety during this period that leads to the outgrowth of those kinds of organizations at the end of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. I think that continues throughout the 20th century, but also the digitization of records makes all of this stuff a whole lot easier and also makes it more easily monetized. So you can get an ancestry subscription, or you can buy 23andMe, and you can, do these connections. We got it for my mother several years ago. She found out that we are descended from Richard III, which is a hell of a connection, but my daughters love it, so it's great. And I also, but a lot of what's making that possible is the Mormons, who are the ones digitizing these records and making them available. And they're making them available. They're doing this to, give post-death baptisms into their faith to folks who have died. I mean, that's their interest in genealogy. So, there's this kind of undercurrent of unsettling things about it. But yes, I think it emerges in part due to some of the same impulses that are stirred up by the 1876 centennial.
Okay. So the order is going to be Philip, then we have Sandy, and then Elisa. So Philip's question, what happened to the collection of the Atwater Kent Museum after it closed, and does Philadelphia have any plans to reestablish a museum of the city of Philadelphia?
I have heard no plans to reestablish the city of Philadelphia. The city is obligated under its charter to have one, but I think that they are unlikely to do that in an era when budget constraints are what they are. In my fantasy of fantasies, uh, someone would buy Wanamaker's now that Macy's is vacating it and turn that into the City Museum of Philadelphia. But I think that it would require outside financing, and you would need someone like a Jerry Lenfest, who was largely responsible for both contributing his own money and getting other well-heeled folks to contribute money for the Museum of the American Revolution. And I don't know that those folks would see a value in it. I don't know that those folks would see a path forward to making such an institution sustainable. The collection itself was transferred to the custody of Drexel University. They do not own the collection, but they are in possession of the collection. And they are in the process of cataloging it and making it available for folks, typically through online exhibits. Now, the people that they have working on it are very, very serious people, well respected in the field, but without an institution to house it and display it, and without a group of curators and other kinds of folks to assemble exhibits, I think that you're going to have a hard time keeping it going and making it available to the public. So I hope that answers your question.
Our next question comes from Sandy. The first Dutch West India Company settlers in 1624 were scattered to locations including South River before being recalled to Manhattan a year or two later. Is anything known about that settlement?
So I am not an expert in those settlements or this period of history beyond what goes on in the Delaware Valley. So I would say your best bet is to take a look at the notes from in my book from that period and review those. And I think that they would give you an answer to that question. There are also a lot of very smart folks working in this period. And it would be worth seeing what they're doing as an answer to that question.
Very good. Elisa Hogate has a question.
Hello.
Hi.
I would like to know what is being done with our Swedish culture now for the 250th anniversary. The New Sweden Center is planning to do something, and I have a question that I want to ask you about that. So it's a double-fold question.
Okay. I am not affiliated with the museum. I mean, I'm very appreciative of them hosting me, but I don't work there. So I don't know what their plans are for the 250th. It has been my experience with the 250th that you have several levels. You have a national level, you have a Commonwealth level, and then you have county level organizations, all of whom are pursuing different objectives based on the resources that they have available and what people's interests are. And I also think that on some level, individual institutions are going to be doing kind of their own things because there isn't a central organizing body that's kind of moving this ball forward, which is why I'm concerned that we are, basically 18 months out from the summer of 2026. And I don't feel like I really have a sense of what this landscape looks like. There's been some reporting in the Philadelphia Inquirer about changes in the Philadelphia 250 committee. There was apparently some rancor among members in 2022 and 2023. I think that's abated somewhat. But the chairperson of that organization just left to take another job. So it is vacant, which is, alarming given how close we are to this event. all of which kind of feels like a dodge. I would definitely recommend speaking with folks at the museum if you're curious about what they have planned, because they would know better than I what they're planning on doing.
I
Yeah,
have I have now got two questions. The second question is, can you tell me if Delaware was turn that off. If the state of Delaware was either part of Pennsylvania or was it a state in 1750?
So Delaware was originally a portion, what is now Delaware was originally a portion of Pennsylvania. It was known as the three lower counties.
Right.
And it got spun off in the 18th century into its own thing. As a matter of fact, John Dickinson, who signs the Declaration of Independence and I think the Constitution, was both at various times from Pennsylvania, quote unquote, and from Delaware, quote unquote, based on the status of it being spun off. But yes, at one time, Delaware was part of the colony of Pennsylvania.
very good. So,
Why
so sorry, Lisa, just before you say your next question, we will be taking a couple more questions. Elisa, if you'd like to say your last question.
last question is, would there be any reason why the different organizations, and there are many of them, including Finnish organizations and Lenape organizations, where we could unite together and work together on a project so that we wouldn't all be doing the same thing at the same time or something different?
Sure. Yeah. It's been my experience that working across institutional barriers is possible, but it does require someone to spearhead that. It does require someone to build enthusiasm for it and to build support, mostly financial, for it. The Lenape are headquartered, I want to say, in Kansas or Wisconsin. Their national headquarters is not in the Delaware Valley. But certainly there are genealogical organizations, there are fraternal organizations. People could reach out to those folks and build some kind of participation. The problem is, as someone who works at an institution on the day to day and is frequently approached by other organizations, is that all sucks up time from uh, you know a very, very set day, right? Like there are only 24 hours in the day. And there are other responsibilities involved in keeping the lights on, keeping the insurance payments happening, all that kind of stuff. And so I think that it does require a fair amount of vision and a lot of person power. Um, Often that comes from, not from staff, but from volunteers in my experience. So, all that's a way of saying, yes, it's possible. It's just a matter of finding those right folks and getting them engaged in the ways that you'd like to see them be engaged.
Okay, I know that Tracy wanted to jump in really quick as well. But before that, I'd just like to say our last question will be Sandra Plath. I'll be reading that in a moment. Tracy?
I was just going to answer for Elisa that the New Sweden Alliance is definitely still gathering together everyone in the Swedish and Finnish groups to work together on programs and initiatives. So that is happening, just not a big focus on 2026 at this point in time.
Very good. All right, so Paul, Sandra Plath's question, did you do any research on the importance that women played in the developing Philadelphia?
It's funny that you should ask that. I will actually be giving a talk to a women's organization that is built around the history of women in Philadelphia. And of course, women are Philadelphians, and so they have a history. So yes, it's interesting, and we could spend hours talking about that. But what I will suggest to you is that one of the interesting things about Philadelphia's history is we do have this very, very deep bench of revolutionary artifacts and icons like Independence Hall, which quickly gets mobilized in the middle part of the 19th century for political purposes. Lincoln comes in 1861 as he's on his way to be inaugurated president, tries to use it as a backdrop for encouraging the seceded states to come back into the Union. Obviously, that doesn't work. But the women's suffrage movement quickly adopts these icons as a way of arguing for equality for women. And as we get into the 20th century, these icons become mobilized in a variety of liberation movements, gay rights, the civil rights movement, and of course, the women's liberation movement. And it's interesting because on the one hand, Philadelphia experiences these upheavals the same as the rest of the nation. On the other hand, Philadelphia is unique in that it has these symbols that have very specific meanings ascribed to them and become therefore very attractive for liberation movements like abolitionism, like civil rights, like the women's rights and suffrage movements. So yes, the short answer is yes. There's quite a bit about it in the book, and I will be doing a talk next month specifically on those elements of the book.
Very good. So for those of you at home, put that on your calendar. Do we have any final questions?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, David.
Yeah, I was wondering if Paul had any specific knowledge about the genealogy of Philadelphia area prior to Penn, and what's any hints about researching? I'm a direct descendant of Joseph Yard and his three sons. I don't know if that rings a bell, but they built the Old Swedes Church in Philadelphia and Wilmington in the late 1600s. But I don't know where he came from or when he came. Is it pretty unlikely that an Englishman would be in Philadelphia prior to Penn?
No, it's incredibly likely, actually. It's incredibly likely. There were English folks in New Jersey. There were definitely English folks at the Falls of the Delaware, and there were some English folks here prior to Penn getting here. So it's absolutely possible. I am not a trained genealogist, but my suggestion would be that you make an appointment at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. They have a fantastic wealth of resources. They also have connections to professional genealogists who can help you kind of connect the dots and build out your family tree. And when you do it at somewhere like HSP, the likelihood is there'll be other kinds of records, tax records, those kinds of things there, or they will know where to find them that can help you create a very robust picture of your ancestors' life. If you go to their website, you will see that there are resources for scheduling an appointment, for working with their reference folks. They have a whole thing about genealogy on there. That would be my suggestion. It's not going to be free, but they are the best in the business, and I would definitely recommend reaching out to them.
Could I have one more question, please? It's Sandra Pfaff. Just for everybody who is interested in Atwater, Kent, I was there not too long ago. They store some of our uniforms for the emergency aid. They have a lot of collections that you can go and see. You must make an appointment. There's usually a person or two there who will invite you in.
Thank you, Sandra.
I wanted to mention anyone interested in genealogy of the people who were at New Sweden. There are books, and you can get them in some libraries by a fellow named Peter Stebbins Craig, who did an incredible amount of research on the early Swedes.
Oh,
it's
yes,
absolutely first class. So
yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Has
Okay.
anybody been in touch with the Swedish Colonial Society? They have a wonderful program of research that will give you your ancestors' history.
Very good. Make note of that as well. Okay. Paul,
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate everyone coming out today. If you have any other further questions or you want to reach out just to chat, my website is www.paulmclean.com. paulkahan.com. There's a form on there. You can fill it out. It'll send me an email, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Excellent. And for upcoming lectures as part of this New Sweden Legacy Lecture Series, please see the screen below. Our next talk is on February 19th. Thank you, everyone, very much. That concludes today's event and lecture.